opinions or stars, one of them. Okay, if we can find meaning on life, how about the others? What are their meanings? Why God creates so many of them? I heard one priest, he said this in theology called the waste of God.
Holy waste.
Holy waste,
Holy
yeah.
waste, yes.
Okay, can you
Yes.
understand my question?
It occurs to me this is not a full answer to your question, which I can't give, but I wish I knew the answer to it. But what some philosophers who reflected on Christianity, Paul Ricoeur is a good example. He's a philosopher, a very good philosopher. As he observed what he finds distinctive about the Christian vision of things, especially from the teaching of Jesus, is the logic of superabundance, something we humans don't know much about when we never practice it. We have, in most societies, organized themselves in accordance with the logic of equivalence or the logic of fairness. But what explodes into Ricoeur's religious sensibilities when he reflects on the figure of Christ is a whole new logic. The logic of holy waste, if you will, superabundance. The parables of Jesus. Matthew's parable of the laborers in the vineyard, for example, who some of them worked all day and some of them worked only a few hours. But the ones who worked only a few hours get the same wage as those who worked for many hours. And you find similar types of thinking and spirituality in Jesus' teaching. Christians, when a good theological axiom, I think, is when we think about God and the universe, we should not just take any old idea of God, like the idea of a designer, or the idea of someone who's fair and will repay the enemies of God and so forth. We should think of Jesus, because the Christian understanding of God, the key to the Christian understanding of God, and this is what makes Christianity a different kind of faith from other traditions, is the man Jesus. Look at him if you want your understanding of God. So the idea of the holy waste that you're talking about comes, I think, from the kind of theological thinking that reflects on that. Now, to bring Teilhard back into the picture, Teilhard said something that I think is very important, but very few Catholics have paid much attention to it. And that's that any God who does not, in immensity, enormity, and infinity, surpass this universe, no matter how big this universe is, no matter how many other universes there may be. The multiverse hypothesis is becoming very popular today too. But any God who is smaller than this immensity is not one to whom we can kneel. But unfortunately, our teaching and preaching and catechesis and religious education often give us a God who is smaller than the universe. And one of the reasons, and Teilhard recognized this too, and I think it's true, one of the reasons for the popularity of naturalism today, the pure naturalism, it's a strong temptation. In the academic community, naturalism, I think, is the conventional wisdom today. One of the reasons for that is that our religions have given people a God who is smaller than the universe. And so one of the great implications of Teilhard's thought, at least as I've read it, is that is the axiom that whenever you think you have an understanding of God, make sure that it's not smaller than the universe. Now, to come back to the question, this childlike question, why is the universe so big and why is it so old? This is something that I'm reflecting on a lot at the moment, and I hope to write something on this in the future. And here I've drawn a lot of help from the Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan, who is my favorite philosopher of science. Not too many philosophers of science are familiar with him. But he gives us the notion of a universe of what he calls emergent probability. Frank Budenholzer has written on this. He can say more about this than I can. What emergent probability means is that if you have enough numbers, enough spatial immensity, enough temporal enormity, what is improbable can sooner or later become more probable, increasing or emergent probability. And this is something that I think is so open-minded that it can even accept the notion of multiverses, that there are many, many universes. Maybe to have this kind of universe, a life-bearing and mind-bearing universe, maybe philosophers or scientists like Martin Rees are correct in suggesting that maybe there's a multiverse. That would certainly fit the notion of superabundance. Even from a terrestrial vantage point, we live in an environment of tremendous biodiversity. St. Thomas Aquinas once asked the question, why did God create so many different things? And he answered that because what is lacking in one, as far as being able to represent the divine infinity, can be supplied by something else. And what's lacking in that, and there's always something lacking in anything finite, can be supplied by something else. In terms of that logic, it would not at all be contradictory to even Catholic traditional thought, that there would have to be many, many universes. But I would just add one final thought to all this, and that's the recent discovery by science that cosmic reality, that nature is narrative and dramatic. This is something relatively new. For centuries, we thought that Einstein himself thought that matter is basically the same eternally. Not much is going on. And this is why he even resisted his own equations and denied for a while the possibility of a changing, dynamic, expanding universe. But with the acceptance of the expanding universe, the narrative aspect of nature has become very clear. Now, when you reflect on the question of what is it that makes a narrative possible, I think you need three things. First of all, you need an indeterminacy. You need a set of events whose outcome is in some respect indeterminate. If it were determined from the start, it wouldn't be a story at all. It would be just a fixed unfolding of a mechanism. But secondly, there has to be a kind of consistency or lawfulness, a degree of that too, blended into the indeterminacy. And recently I've found myself using the analogy of grammar to understand the laws, so-called laws of nature, which for many years were understood mechanistically as deterministic principles operative in the movement of matter. Atomistic and materialist thinking especially thought in a very non-narrative thing. Even today, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher of evolution, thinks of evolution simply as a reshuffling of stuff over the course of, it's very Democritean, very atomistic. There's nothing narrative about it. What I got from Teilhard is the sense that there's something ineradicably narrative about nature. So to have the element of indeterminacy and some degree of determinacy or consistency, and the third ingredient is what's required is time. I think that understanding of narrative, what is necessary for a narrative, can help us. Bernard Lonergan, this is Bernard Lonergan's answer. This is the answer to the question. This makes intelligible this incredible immensity that you started talking about when you asked your question. It gives a narrative coherence. It's not necessarily a mathematical intelligibility, but it's a narrative coherence to the cosmos that we didn't think about. Philosophy of science doesn't, even today, as far as I can tell, doesn't think much, or at least deeply enough, about the narrative character of nature. And then the other aspect of narrative, as I mentioned earlier, is that narratives are capable of carrying a meaning. And this is why it's not silly at all to ask the question, is there something more going on here in this cosmic process than science itself? Atomistic science or materialist science can itself find. And I think my way of looking upon materialist science and pure naturalistic science is that it's pure grammar. It's very good, for example, at deciphering the grammar of life, the Darwinian recipe for evolution. But it doesn't back up or doesn't look deep enough beneath the surface to ask the question, is there some meaning in addition to the grammar going on here? And it's in that context that I find an intelligibility in this immensity and temporal enormity that we didn't see before we started looking at the universe as a narrative. One time a great Jewish rabbi was asked the question, why did God create humans? And the rabbi answered, because God loves stories. I'd like to apply that same logic to the universe. Why did God create all this immensity, enormity, and maybe even multiplicity of worlds? Because maybe God loves really big stories. I don't think we can rule that out as unscientific.
Since it's almost time for our tea break, so yeah, okay, Professor William here. I hear we have Professor William Carroll from our University of Oxford. He's visiting our philosophy department.
Yes. Thank you. It might seem at first to be a kind of historical quibble about your notion of the pre-Copernican world and the relationship between spirituality and the cosmology of that pre-Copernican world, a relationship which we cannot return to in any way because science has shown us all that to be false. I'm troubled because the analysis you gave of that world, and obviously in a brief presentation, it couldn't be so nuanced. The analysis of, for example, the distinction between spirit and matter and so forth is all a form of Neoplatonic or Platonic dualism, which I think is accurate and a rejection of the world of matter and so forth. But if one looks to the thought of Albert the Great, or of Thomas Aquinas, or of the broad Aristotelian tradition in the Middle Ages, one has, I think, still significant resources for talking about the relationship between the natural sciences, theology, and the spiritual quest, resources which, although often expressed in terms that reflect that a certain cosmology, are not wedded to it in such a way that they would not serve as resources for us today to talk about the relationship between science and spirituality. And I think especially in this respect, Albert and Thomas.
That's an excellent question, and you're right, I just passed over this. And I passed over what is the most distinctive aspect of Catholic tradition, and that's its sacramentalism, which I think is beautifully articulated by the great theologians of the Middle Ages, that they were not so detached from nature that they saw it as evil. They saw it as sacramentally representative, and they followed the principle of the incarnation. So what I was doing was looking at a kind of extreme form of spirituality, which is still very much around. But even the sacramental view, which I love and I think is, when I think of Catholicism, I think of sacramental, is something that I think now, in the light of science, can undergo further development and take on a more futuristic, eschatological, earth, cosmic dimension that it did not have, even in Thomas and so forth. And I see a kind of conflict between the traditional Catholic understanding of divine perfection as eternal presence and the biblical understanding of God as the coming of the future. I think there's some tension there, and part of it's reflected in the difference between Catholic and Protestant thought. Compare, for example, Jürgen Moltmann with some of the contemporary Catholic thinkers. There's a tension that needs to be worked out, and so what I'm thinking today is that we need